Nancy McNally moved to Westminster, Colorado back in 1977 to a subdivision that butted up to a farm. There was a lot of open space, and she had a young family.
We were ready to have our third child.
She's lived in this neighborhood ever since. The farm is long gone. She's driving us through what replaced it, house after house. Some ranch style, a few split levels, a couple of cul-de-sacs too.
I mean, we watched it all grow. We were the first street, and then they went this way.
But she feels even as more people have moved in over the years, the overall vibe of the neighborhood has endured. This is a place where everyone knows each other.
My neighbors here are from Vietnam, and we've had 3 generations live there. These folks, it's their first home to ever buy, and these folks, Larry Garlick, used to work for the city, and they raised their 4 boys there.
This is also a place where neighbors help each other.
When somebody has had a heart attack or stroke or whatever, you know that. And in the snow, I have a snow blower, so I go out and snow plow everybody out.
This is a key feature of the Westminster way of life. McNally says people know each other and they support each other. It used to be a quiet farming community until a highway was built between Denver and Boulder back in the 1950s. Then Westminster grew especially rapidly in the 70s when people like McNally moved there. But city leaders at the time did something about it. They slowed growth.
McNally is actually Mayor McNally, and she's served 3 non-consecutive terms as the leader of this city that lies northwest of Denver. But she says this Westminster way of life she's always known is now under attack. Local leaders are losing their authority to decide what the future of their city will look like.
That's because the state is requiring some cities to get denser, pushing them to greenlight backyard apartments, townhomes, duplexes, and other multifamily projects, and to cut down on parking requirements.
McNally says the state is overstepping. These are decisions for local leaders to make.
We're the ones that talk to the neighbors in the stores, at town halls. We are the face of the city and have to make decisions around the city. And I can't sit there and say to them, well, these laws tell us we have to build, this is the only land we have, so sorry you live there, but this is what's going to happen. It makes no sense for our city, but this is what I have to do.
Westminster and several other Colorado cities are pushing back, suggesting, and in some cases flat out saying, that they have no intention of complying with Colorado's new development laws. And at the heart of these objections is the loss of local control.
Historically, local governments in Colorado and across the nation have had domain over the rules that shape their growth, which is why these state laws are making McNally's blood pressure rise.
I will die on local control.
Governor Jared Polis says these laws don't come with an opt-out box to check. He insists they're necessary to tackle Colorado's affordable housing crisis.
We don't know yet how or whether this conflict will escalate, but it's entirely possible it will end up in court. However the fight shakes out, it could not only reshape how Coloradans live and move through their state, it could also change who wields the power to make those decisions.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance, a show about Colorado politics, policy, and the 2025 state legislature. I'm Benta Berkland, and joining me is CPR's transportation and growth reporter, Nathaniel Miner. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Benta.
Governor Jared Polis has made how the state grows a really big focus of his second term in office. And he's pushed for measures that would increase density. In his view, more housing and public transit near the kinds of things we all want and need, like work and groceries and entertainment, will make Colorado cities more affordable and environmentally friendly and just overall better places to live.
Yes, that's right. This has been his vision recently, and last year, he largely got what he wanted. The state legislature passed several bills to encourage this kind of development. One of those marquee pieces of legislation says that cities must allow for greater residential density near major bus and rail stations.
I remember when that bill finally passed. It had failed the year before on the final day of the legislative session, and Democrats were really upset about it. One of the sponsors was talking to colleagues and choked up, and then the other sponsor was in tears.
Yeah, that first year, they went really big on a super comprehensive bill, and it totally crashed and burned at the last minute. But then the next year, last year, they broke it up into these smaller bills.
Yes, and the state also passed other laws that require cities to do things like allow accessory dwelling units and to get rid of minimum parking requirements for new developments, all in the name of encouraging more density.
For the governor, it's not just about improving the quality of life or making it better for the environment. He says these kinds of laws are needed to start to make a dent in the state's overall housing shortfall. And the state took a look at this. They put together a housing task force, and that found that Colorado was short more than 325,000 housing units. And that's both for current and future residents of the state.
One thing is that many Colorado communities kind of look similar to Westminster.
Right, yes.
Lots of single-family homes. So denser neighborhoods would be a pretty big change for these areas that were built with the idea that you're just going to drive everywhere. And lots of people like Mayor McNally like the way things are right now.
That's right. Some of these laws start to kick in later this year. And to be clear, some cities are really into this density push. Denver, Boulder, Longmont, and Broomfield. An environmental group tracking these laws says that most cities are actually complying with them. But there are others, and I found Westminster, Arvada, they're not into these laws at all. Their leaders are saying, no thank you, and they're citing reasons like loss of neighborhood character, like you heard from Mayor McNally, inadequate infrastructure, and they point out that they're still waiting on transit lines that were promised years ago. Their fundamental problem with these new laws is that they say that development is a local, not a state issue, and they do not want to let go of their power.
A lot to dig in on this episode, and I'm so glad you've joined us to help us do that and look at what these communities are trying to do to block these state laws.
Let's do it.
Before we move on to how communities want to fight these state laws, let's take a minute to go through the laws that have these local officials so worked up.
So the most potentially consequential law, as I mentioned before, would require many of the state's biggest cities to allow more dense housing near frequent public transit lines. And here's how it would work. Cities have to set housing opportunity goals, or HOGs, which is probably like the worst acronym. And these goals are calculated based on how much land is near transit lines. Then they have to change their zoning to allow that many homes to be built.
So this law doesn't necessarily require a city to build housing, right?
No, that is not really how housing works in this country. Cities just have to allow more housing. So let's take Westminster, for example. They calculated that its housing goal would be about 50,000 units, which is a lot. There are only about 50,000 housing units in Westminster right now.
Under this, it could potentially double in size?
Well, not exactly. This law does not mean that 50,000 new homes will be built. Westminster, for example, can count some existing zoning capacity and homes toward that goal of 50,000 new units. And just because land is zoned for high density does not mean that a developer is going to come in and build it.
Are developers already eyeing this available land for development?
Well, developers will only build if it makes financial sense. Like if a developer isn't going to make money, they're not going to build. But another new law is meant to help more projects pencil out. That one's about parking.
Yes, I covered that parking bill a bit at the State House, and I remember at the time it kind of surprised me when lawmakers passed this parking law and discussed it, because I guess I didn't realize before how much parking can factor into what gets developed and what doesn't.
Oh yeah, parking is huge. There are whole books out there that try to explain the world through parking, and I will tell you, once you read them, you will not see cities in the same way. And the dynamic here is that for decades, cities around the country have required developers to build off-street parking spaces when they put up apartments and townhomes. But the research shows that these rules actually drive up costs because parking requires more space, more concrete. That's all super costly. And collectively, it makes communities more sprawly and less walkable. So this new law is trying to unwind all of that.
Let's talk about the other new law on accessory dwelling units. Passing that wasn't nearly as controversial.
Yes, so the state now requires most communities to let people build what are known as ADUs, small backyard homes. And then finally, there's another new law that prevents local governments from setting arbitrary caps on how many people can live together as roommates.
If developers take advantage of these laws, we could potentially, at least backers hope, start to see a lot of communities get denser, get more housing, which the governor says will help drive down housing prices and allow people to move around more easily from where they need to go with or without a car.
But I think it's important to say we're not talking about New York City levels of density. That is not what Governor Polis is pushing for. Think more like Capitol Hill in Denver. Old neighborhoods with a real mix of housing. You know, big old Victorians next to a 6-unit apartment, next to a 12-story high-rise maybe. Neighborhoods that were built around streetcars, and they're still pretty walkable today.
One thing that anyone who's been in Denver knows, parking already can be a challenge. So what would it mean to build more density without parking? As you pointed out, we're not New York City. We don't have as easy transit, and I've heard concerns about that aspect of it.
For sure, yeah. And that's just part of the deal with a neighborhood like Capitol Hill, where it's hard to park your car, but you can walk to the grocery store. Some Colorado cities are totally on board with this kind of vision. So the Denver City Council, for example, is actually considering rolling back their parking minimums altogether, which would go beyond what the new state law requires. And I stopped by what I think you could call an anti-parking event at a brewery in Denver last month.
So you were like writing love letters to city leaders to say,
yes, you know, it's
dial it back on the parking.
It's almost Valentine's Day, and so we went in on a Valentine's theme. You've got Valentine's little heart headgear and heart glasses, and we're writing Valentine's to our counselors saying, please support this.
This is Ryan Keeney with YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard Denver, and they're an advocacy group that has backed all these housing density laws.
This one says, Dear City Councilor, I'm writing to urge you to support removing parking mandates from the zoning code. It's critical we do everything we can to increase affordable housing and reduce car dependence. Thanks for all your work.
People like Keeney and Governor Polis want a future where there are a lot more homes and a lot fewer cars, where cities are more walkable and transit-friendly, and they cite research that suggests when more homes are built, prices can moderate and actually even fall.
And we're very excited about this because parking factors in enormously on our housing crisis and our climate crisis.
Denver's clearly an example of one of those cities that's very receptive to more density and doing things above and beyond what the state law required.
Yes, it sure seems like it. I found evidence of cities passing local regulations already to comply with these new state laws, and still others are actively talking about doing that. So there is a lot of energy there. But in other city halls, the state's power grab is running into a buzzsaw of opposition.
Fascinating topic and a lot to dig in here on this issue. And we're going to get into more details about that opposition in a bit. We'll also look at what some communities are trying to do to protect themselves from these state laws.
You love podcasts to keep up with the news. Now there's an easy way to find out what's happening in Colorado every day. The Colorado Today podcast is new from the same trusted source that brings you Purplish. You'll get the top stories, on-the-ground reporting, and moments of curiosity. Follow Colorado Today for the statewide news you need each weekday on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance. Nathaniel, you've been tracking how some local governments are really pushing back hard against the state's plan for denser housing.
Yes. The bills passed last year, and city planners have been doing all sorts of analysis to figure out what their impact is going to be locally. And on the horizon are deadlines by which cities need to be in compliance. So right now, we're in this phase where city councils are grappling with what these laws mean for them. And as I mentioned earlier, Westminster's analysis shows they'd have to change their zoning to allow tens of thousands of new housing units. And that number really scared people, really set off city councilors at a recent meeting. Here is City Councilor Christine Ireland.
Everyone's going to flee this state in droves because people want single-family homes. We have the shortest single-family homes. That's why people are leaving this state. They don't want to live in apartments from birth to death. I saw this stuff in Russia, and it was built under linen.
I watched several city council meetings to get a sense of where residents are at in Westminster, and some people were glad to see their city leaders pushing back against the state. Here's Westminster resident Karen Calavity, who is upset about some new apartments and other dense development.
To me, it's nothing but high-density, expensive tenement housing that's going up there.
Mayor McNally told me she takes this kind of feedback super seriously. She and other local leaders agonize over development decisions because the people those decisions affect are right there. We're talking about neighbors, the family at church, your kid's teacher.
We've heard from the Westminster mayor that she's concerned these laws would change the city's character and change the way of life. Do other cities have similar concerns?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I found at least a handful of others that are really upset. So Arvada, Colorado Springs, North Glen, most recently Lafayette talked about this. And there certainly could be others too. And each one of those cities has mentioned different laws that they have problems with. But the objections, I would say, are kind of similar to what we're hearing from Westminster here.
I want to ask you how transit factors into all of this. If cities are forced to allow more density, less parking, it seems like that is going to make transit that much more important. Is there enough transit to make it still convenient for people to not use a car?
City leaders will say, no, there isn't. In the Denver region, of course, it's the Regional Transportation District that provides transit. And cities like Westminster are not happy with RTD at all. They say they need a lot more bus service than what RTD is providing, and they're still waiting on train service that RTD promised years ago and has yet to build.
That's the train to Boulder and to Longmont.
Yes, exactly. RTD has built one station for that line in Westminster, but there's supposed to be another one, and Westminster's still waiting on it. And I guess we should also add here that the state has heard some of these concerns from cities and has actually created new money for transit through new fees on oil and gas and on rental cars. But it's still an open question as to whether or not that's going to be enough money to really boost transit to a level that people are really happy with.
I can certainly see why some local officials and communities feel pretty jaded about this because the denser community and not having the parking really only works well if you do have easy access to transit that's convenient.
Yeah, I think that's right. And underlying all of this is the objection that city leaders don't like being told what to do by the state. And they say they're not against density as a rule. And Mayor McNally actually says they're promoting it, but only where they want to, where the community has weighed in and where they say it makes sense. So, for example, Mayor McNally took me to this entirely new downtown that's going up on the site of an old mall in Westminster.
So this is kind of one of those defunct shopping malls that we see?
It used to be. The only thing left is a JCPenney. And Mayor McNally was super jazzed to show off this cute little downtown to me.
Yeah, so let's just walk around and kind of tell me what we're looking at and what the vision was.
Dentist finally down here. Everybody needs a dentist. And we do have another one on the property that originally owned, and he's needed too. So he's here up above our apartment buildings, and we have a bank finally here.
So there's a smoothie place, a hotel, a coffee shop. We're about a 10-minute walk from a frequent bus line that can take you downtown Denver in just 20 minutes.
Apartments down this way. So I don't know what's on this block.
But sort of a classic business on the first floor and then 4 stories of apartments above. Downtown, it feels like a little downtown.
hearing your tape when you're out with the mayor, she just sounds really pleased with all this and excited to show it.
She was so proud of this little downtown. And even at recent city council meetings, some residents said they wanted more development like this, the walkable, transit-first kind of stuff. So here's Vivek Sundaraj, who told the council he's lived in Westminster for 25 years.
When we were much younger, my family and I lived in suburban Pittsburgh, and we and our 2 children were a one-car family there because I was able to ride mass transit. I rode the bus for a while.
Sundaraj explained to council members that having easy access to public transit made his family's life better.
I lived nearby and it was very convenient. And so this helped keep our costs down when we were a young family.
Is it fair to say that, in this case, Westminster is in part fulfilling the state's vision, even though Westminster leaders have said they don't like what the governor and what lawmakers have done on housing?
Yes, for sure. Governor Polis would love downtown Westminster. But it's a question of scale and location, right? This level of density that we're talking about has been planned carefully by local leaders. And Mayor McNally does not want the state to come in and force Westy to allow it in more of the places where they don't want it. So after talking about this, the Westminster City Council told its staff to not comply with 3 of these new laws. Other cities have said similar things. They are not about to give up their authority just because the state tells them to.
Okay.
Spicy stuff, huh, Benta?
Yes, exactly. I need to go to city council meetings more. Now that we've gone through some of these key things and the concerns they bring up for cities, I think it's time to get into legally why some local communities think they have the power to resist a state law. And that comes down to 2 big words we hear a lot in Colorado politics: local control.
Local control.
City leaders in places like Westminster are flat out saying they will not comply with these new housing laws. What happens next?
So one really important thing to know before we get into that is Westminster and dozens of other cities are something called home rule governments. And under the state constitution, the laws that home rule cities and counties pass generally supersede state law.
There are limits on that, though. A city can't just ignore all the laws the state passes.
That's right. Yeah, the real distinction is whether an issue at hand is of statewide concern, like voting or criminal justice, or a local concern. For instance, whether to allow backyard chickens or to determine how close together gas stations can be.
And when it comes to housing and development, this issue will really come down to, is this a local concern or statewide?
Yes, and traditionally it's been treated as a local concern. But state legislators last year tried to get around this by declaring that their bills address, quote, matters of mixed statewide and local concern. And they argue that every local development regulation actually has an impact beyond its borders. So if one city limits housing, it can put pressure on the town next door because you have more people struggling to find an affordable place to live.
How do you think this plays out? I mean, you have the state passing laws. You have cities saying, we're not going to follow these laws. Inevitably, is this going to be decided by the courts?
Well, one option is cities could sue and ask the state Supreme Court to agree that lawmakers overstepped by trying to tell them what to do on this issue. Mayor McNally in Westminster says they aren't currently getting ready to sue, but she kind of seemed to leave the door open to it. When I checked in with the Colorado Municipal League, they said they weren't aware of any legal challenges brewing either.
What about the other side? Supporters of these laws. This is a huge issue for Polis and a lot of other people. Can they sue the cities and try to get the courts to order cities to change their zoning laws?
So some of the laws have enforcement mechanisms in them, like withholding state grants of a certain kind, but others don't. And so really that leaves the state with legal action. Yeah, so they could sue. We do not have any indication that that's going to happen, though. So far, state authorities just say that they want to work with cities and also add that they expect cities to comply with the law. So I would say we're still in the let's try to play nice phase of this discussion.
Let's say it moves beyond that playing nice phase and eventually it does end up in court. Do you have any sense if the justices would agree that it's a local versus a statewide issue?
I spoke with Bill Kyriagis about this. He's an adjunct law professor at CU Boulder, and you should know that he works at Otten Johnson, a law firm that's a CPR underwriter, but he's an expert on land use law in Colorado. And he told me courts have generally found that land use and zoning is indeed a matter of local concern. But he pointed to a few interesting exceptions.
What are some of the exceptions?
So there's a statewide ban on rent control in Colorado, and a few decades ago, the town of Telluride challenged that with a local measure.
The court went through an analysis and determined that while the town of Telluride had authority as a local matter to regulate land use, the state had authority as a matter of statewide or mixed concern to regulate economic things like rent control, and allowed for the state regulation to apply.
Courts have also ruled against the local ban on oil and gas drilling, saying that the state's right to regulate energy production superseded local rules.
How can we apply those principles, or can we, to the housing situation right now?
Kyriagis says there's a fairly complex analysis that judges do in cases like this. They consider 4 factors.
Okay, so what are some of the 4 factors?
Okay, let's not get into it too deeply because it's kind of complicated, but basically it's an analysis that courts do, and they look at things like whether local regulations have impacts beyond their borders, and we've talked about that already, and whether the state or local governments have traditionally handled the issue at hand.
When we're talking about housing, the idea that local regulations impact people who live outside a town or city's borders, I think that's interesting because everything is pretty interconnected across the state. And frequently where people live is not where they work, where they're commuting to every day.
And so there's really an argument here that I think legislators have made that all these little local housing laws actually add up to make a de facto state housing law. And that's what they tried to address by declaring that their bills were a matter of mixed state and local concern.
How do you think this could shake out in court?
We're talking about a number of different laws, and there are a lot of different cities across the state. So Kyriagis says how it shakes out is really going to come down to the unique circumstances of what ends up in court.
And I think whatever did end up in court in that decision, that's going to be a pretty big deal for people across Colorado.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to speculate too much on how a legal challenge might work out because we're so early in this process and there's so many different laws, yada, yada. But another thing that we should maybe throw out there is it's possible that a developer could sue a city for not following the state law. So really, we're going to have to see how this goes.
And I know you've probably run into this, but certainly for me, heading into the last election, when I was out talking to voters, affordability is something I hear time and again from people, and certainly housing. So I think it continues to be pretty top of mind for a lot of Coloradans.
Yeah, the stakes are pretty high right now. We're talking about potentially changing who has the fundamental power to decide how communities grow.
As we wrap this up, there really is a powerful idea, though, that local issues are best handled by those at the local level, whether it's officials or people living there.
But now we're at a point where legislators say all these local decisions over the years have cascaded into a giant problem, our state's housing crisis.
If a judge agrees that this is a statewide issue, that means our cities and our transportation could eventually look pretty different than they do now.
A judge also might strike down these laws, meaning that cities would retain their power. It's an open question whether the state's intervention could actually solve the housing crisis. But we also know that so far, city-led control hasn't yet either.
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
The CCNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Nathaniel Miner.
And I'm Benta Berglund. Our producer is Stephanie Wolf. This episode was edited by Megan Verley and sound designed and engineered by Shane Rumsey. The Purplish theme music is by Brad Turner.
And special thank you to KDNK Community Radio, which hosted Benta this week. Purplish will be back in your feeds next week. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.